The moment that woman pushed through the door of the lantern in the first snow of November, the whole room seemed to drop a beat, colder, quieter, as if someone had just thrown open a door straight out into the storm. Tobias Hale was sitting in his usual shadowed corner, the place he came to disappear from the empire that made all of Hartwell's waterfront flinch, and he felt the shift before he even looked up. The woman was soaked through, her dark brown hair plastered against pale cheekbones, one hand gripping the tiny hand of a boy no older than 6, as if he were the only thing still anchoring her to the ground. She didn't belong here. Everyone in the room could see that. But the way she lifted her chin, proud to the point of stubbornness, made you understand she hadn't come begging for pity. She'd come because trouble had chased her all the way to the end of the road. "I need work," she told the diner's manager, a woman named Marlene, her voice steady even as her calloused hands trembled. "Anything at all. I'll wash dishes, clean, work nights, whatever you've got." The boy beside her coughed, a thin wheezing sound from his small chest, and she squeezed his hand tighter. Marlene opened her mouth, the refusal of a diner that couldn't spare a dime already in her eyes, and that's when a low voice from the corner cut through everything. "I'll cover her wages." The whole room turned to look at Tobias Hale, a man in a charcoal suit, his black hair already silvering at the temples, a faint scar running along his jaw that nobody in this city dared ask about. For 5 years they'd known his name, feared it, but no one had ever seen him reach out a hand for anyone. The woman turned, her eyes wary and confused, unable to grasp why the most powerful man in the room would notice a penniless single mother. And Tobias, for the first time in years, was looking at a face that reminded him of someone he hadn't managed to save in time. He didn't yet know that the decision he'd blurted out in those 3 short seconds would change the fate of all 3 people in that room forever. If this story of unexpected kindness and second chances touches your heart, hit that like button to keep us going. Don't forget to share this video with someone who could use a little hope today, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next healing story. Tobias's offer hung suspended in the thick air of the diner, and it took one heartbeat for people to understand that it was real. Rose turned fully toward him, but instead of gratitude, her spine straightened like a cord pulled taut. "I'm not asking for charity," she said, her voice small, but each word falling as hard as paving stone. "I'm asking for work." "Those aren't the same thing, sir." The whole diner fell silent again, but this time it was a different kind of silence. The silence of people watching a sparrow lift its head before a hawk. Marlene stood behind the counter, still holding the towel she had been using to wipe glasses, her eyes moving back and forth between them as if she were watching something she wasn't sure she should stop or allow to continue. Tobias did not move, did not seem offended, only tilted his head slightly, as though her answer was something he had been waiting to hear for a long time, without ever knowing it. Rose did not wait for him to respond. She bent down, pulled the collar of the boy's thin coat closer around him, her hand gently smoothing Eli's damp hair with a tenderness completely at odds with the chin she still held high. "Come on, sweetheart," she whispered. "There's nothing here for us." She turned toward the door, where snow was still slashing sideways across the glass, where the cold waited outside like a patient animal, and in that moment everyone in the diner knew that if that door closed behind her, she would never come back, and perhaps there would be nowhere else for her to go. Eli looked up at his mother, then back at the man in the corner, his tired child's eyes still shining with that strange intuition only children possess, the ability to look through the surface of grown people and touch something underneath. The boy coughed again, a dry cough that shook his small body, and it was that cough, not any spoken word, that made Tobias stand. He did not walk like a man used to giving orders, though the whole city knew that was exactly the kind of man he was. He moved slowly, his hands loose at his sides, keeping enough distance that no one could call it pressure. "I said it wrong," he said, and the sentence made Rose stop right at the threshold. She turned her head, only halfway, enough for him to see the wariness in her eyes. "You're right. Charity and work aren't the same thing, and I chose the wrong words." He paused, letting the silence speak for the rest. "I don't make a habit of repeating myself to anyone, but I'll repeat myself to you. I'm not intending to give you money. I'm intending to hire you. There's a difference. And if you give me exactly 5 minutes at that table, I'll explain what that difference is." Rose looked at him, and people could see the struggle playing out behind her eyes, pride pulling one way, the wheezing breath of her child pulling the other. 2 cords stretched so tight they seemed about to snap. Outside, the wind hissed for a long moment through the crack in the door. Inside, the warmth from the stove and the smell of old coffee wrapped around Eli's trembling little body, and she knew, though she did not want to admit it, that the cold out there would not spare her son tonight. 5 minutes, she finally said, each word pulled from some deep and costly place inside her. No more. Tobias nodded, without the slightest triumph on his face, only something almost like relief flickering there and then disappearing. He gestured toward the table in the shadowed corner, the place he had just left, where the yellow light was dim enough to conceal, but still bright enough for two people to see each other clearly. Marlene, still standing behind the counter, quietly poured a glass of warm milk and set it on a tray, her eyes resting on Tobias for a second longer, a wordless question she had known him long enough to be allowed to ask, and he answered with the faintest nod. Rose led her son across the diner, through curious glances that quickly turned away, and when she settled Eli into the worn leather chair, the boy immediately tucked himself against his mother's side, his eyelids heavy. She sat down across from the man all of Hartwell had to treat with caution, her calloused hands resting on the table, still trembling, but her eyes did not look away. "You have 5 minutes," she reminded him, "and I'll know right away if you lie to me." Tobias did not begin with sweet words, because he understood that with a woman like Rose, sweetness was exactly the thing that would make her stand up and walk away. He placed both elbows on the table, laced his fingers together, and spoke in the low, even voice of a man laying out a business matter, not bestowing a favor. "I have a warehouse on the east side of the harbor," he began, full of crates, records, and ledgers that have been piled up for years without anyone bothering to arrange them properly. People count things wrong, write things down wrong, misplace items worth money, and I don't have time to sit there checking every number myself. Rose listened, her eyes narrowing slightly, and Tobias knew she was weighing every word he said on her own private scale of doubt. "I need someone to look after that mess. Someone to record things, compare them, keep everything in order. But more important than anything," he paused and looked straight at her, "I need someone honest to the point of being inconvenient. Someone who dares tell me to my face when I'm wrong, instead of nodding and then turning away to laugh behind my back. Do you know how many people around me dare do that? Not one. Everyone is so afraid of me that they've forgotten how to tell the truth. It was a lie, and it was also the truth, mixed together so skillfully that even Tobias himself was not entirely sure where the line stood. The warehouse was real, the pile of records was real, but the urgent need he had just built around it was not. He could have hired 10 people to do that work without giving it another thought. Rose sat still for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice was sharp as a thin blade. "You don't need me for that." She said it as a statement, not a question. "A man like you can pay anyone to do that faster and better than I can. So tell me why it has to be me, a woman you met less than 10 minutes ago, soaked to the bone and with nothing but a sick child beside her." Tobias did not flinch from that question, though it struck directly at the weak point in the story he had just woven. He looked down at her calloused hands resting on the tabletop, the kind of calluses only real labor could create, then looked back at that pale but proud face. "Because," he said slowly, "a person desperate enough to walk into this place in a snowstorm asking for work, yet still proud enough to refuse what she believes is charity, is the kind of person who will never steal a single coin from me. I don't need the most skilled worker. I need someone I can trust. And trust is much harder to buy than talent." The sentence hung between them, and Rose did not answer right away, because she knew, even though she did not want to, that there was enough truth in it to keep her from standing up and leaving. She looked down at Eli, who was dozing against her side, his breathing still wheezy but more even now because of the diner's warmth, and she felt a crack open through her pride, not because Tobias had won, but because she no longer had the right to cling to pride when her child needed medicine, food, and a roof that did not leak. "How much does it pay?" she asked, and she hated the way her voice trembled slightly when she said it. Tobias named an amount, and it was high enough to make Rose blink, higher than anything she had ever earned in the months she had spent wearing herself down, washing dishes and mopping floors, so high that the number itself was another lie exposed in the light. She looked at him, and this time her eyes held more than simple suspicion. There was something close to pain in them. The pain of a person who understood she was being pitied but no longer had enough strength to refuse that pity. "You're paying too much," she said quietly. "We both know that." Tobias did not deny it. "Then consider the extra as payment for the honesty I just mentioned," he replied. "The thing I've been looking for a very long time and haven't found." At that exact moment, Marlene appeared beside the table and set down a steaming bowl of hot soup, a plate of bread, and the warm milk for Eli. She did all of it without saying a word, only gently patted Rose's shoulder once as if to say, "Go ahead and eat, child," then quietly turned away. And Rose, the woman who only moments earlier had held her head high before the entire room, looked at that bowl of soup and suddenly found her eyes blurring, not because of the soup itself, but because it had been far too long since anyone had placed something warm before her, without demanding anything in return. While Rose was eating, slowly and trying to keep her manners despite the hunger screaming inside her, Eli woke from his drowsy half-sleep, his eyes opening in the strange warmth of the room, and like every 6-year-old child, his attention quickly drifted away from the bowl of soup toward something else. On the table, near where Tobias was sitting, there was a stack of white napkins and a dull pencil someone had left behind, and Eli, with the quiet instinct of a child used to finding his own small joys in hidden corners, reached out and took one sheet. Rose started to stop him, started to whisper that he shouldn't bother people, but Tobias gave the faintest shake of his head, a gesture so small almost no one saw it, meaning to let the boy be. So Eli bent over the paper, the tip of his tongue sticking slightly from the corner of his mouth in concentration, and the pencil began to move in clumsy, scribbled strokes only children can draw, the most honest language in the world. Adults lie with words, but children draw the truth they don't know how to say. Tobias sat there, pretending to look out the window where the snow was still falling, but from the corner of his eye he kept following that small hand, and something about such an ordinary scene made his chest tighten unexpectedly. When Eli finished, the boy studied his work for a moment with the seriousness of an artist. Then, instead of giving it to his mother as Rose expected, he leaned across the table and pushed the paper toward Tobias, along with a clear little sentence that cut through the silence. "It's for you." Tobias looked down at the paper. On it were 3 stick figures, one tall, one medium-sized with long hair darkened by many pencil strokes, and one very small figure standing in the middle, all 3 holding hands through one awkward connecting line, and behind them was a house with a chimney releasing a curl of smoke, and a sun in the upper corner with rays shining out in every direction. It was a picture millions of children in this world had drawn. Nothing special, nothing unusual. And yet Tobias Hale, the man the entire Hartwell Harbor district lowered its voice to name, sat frozen as he looked at it, as if something invisible had struck him straight in the chest. Because a very long time ago, so long ago he had thought he had forgotten, he had once been given a picture exactly like that, from another small hand, in another kitchen, beneath a roof that now existed only in dreams he never dared tell anyone about. The ice he had spent years building thickly around his heart, the ice that had helped him survive and climb to the top of a world with no room for weakness, had just cracked in one small place, and through that fissure, an old and painful light shone in. Rose, seeing her son bothering the strange and powerful man, quickly set down her spoon and reached to pull the paper back. "Leave him alone, sweetheart. He's very busy," she said quickly, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "I'm sorry, sir. Whenever he sees paper, he starts drawing. I'll keep a closer eye on him." But just as her fingers touched the edge of the paper, Tobias's hand settled over it first. Not hurriedly, not forcefully, simply keeping it there. "Let me keep it," he said, and his voice turned a little rough, a change so slight that only the most perceptive person would have noticed it. But Rose did notice, and she looked up at him with a new confusion, because in that moment, the man before her no longer seemed like the cold employer who had just negotiated wages, but like someone who had just seen the ghost of himself. Tobias lifted the paper, carefully as if it were made of something more fragile than glass, folded it into quarters along neat, straight creases, then placed it inside the breast pocket of his suit, right above where his heart beat. "Thank you," he said to Eli, and the boy grinned wide, a smile missing one front tooth, innocent and unaware that he had just done something no words or money had managed to do in 5 years, touching the real man still left beneath the name that made the whole city afraid. Rose watched the scene, and though she did not yet understand any of it, she suddenly felt, in some vague way, that the decision to sit down for those 5 minutes had opened a door she could no longer close. The warehouse on the east side of the harbor was exactly as Tobias had described, a vast row of open space with towering iron shelves stacked full of cardboard boxes and yellowed ledgers, and during her first week of work, Rose had turned one corner of that chaos into order with her calloused hands and her sharp mind. She counted, recorded, compared, working with a devotion that was almost angry, as if she meant to prove to the man who had hired her that every dollar he paid her was deserved down to the last cent. Tobias stopped by from time to time, not to check on her, or so he told himself, but for reasons of business, though deep down he knew he came more often than necessary. That morning, he arrived earlier than usual, his steps making no sound on the concrete floor because of his soft leather shoes, and he stopped at the end of a row of shelves when he saw Rose at the far end of the room, beside the small wooden table she used as her workspace. She had no idea anyone was watching. On the table before her was a small amber bottle of medicine, the kind of bottle anyone who had ever cared for a child with asthma would recognize at once, and Rose was holding it up beneath the yellow light, giving it a gentle shake, measuring what remained inside with the expression of someone doing a calculation whose answer always made the heart tighten. Then she did something that made Tobias stand rooted in place. She took out a small spoon and an empty bottle that had been washed clean, and with movements so careful they were almost painful to watch, she divided the medicine left in the bottle, measuring out every little bit, splitting the dose that should have lasted only 1 full week into smaller, thinner portions, enough to stretch into 2 weeks, 3 weeks, enough to hold on until she did not know when, until there was money, until mercy came. As she worked, she murmured calculations under her breath, her lips moving around the numbers, and there was one moment when her hand stopped, when she closed her eyes and drew in a deep breath, as if swallowing down something rising in her throat, then opened her eyes again and continued, because she did not have the right to fall apart, because falling apart was a luxury reserved for mothers who still had another choice. Tobias stood there in the darkness between the shelves, and he, a man who had seen enough in his life to believe nothing could still shake him, felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the winter outside. He understood instantly the meaning of what he was seeing, understood it fully and cruelly, in a way no explanation could ever convey. The proud woman who had refused what she called charity, the woman who had lifted her head before an entire room of people, the woman who came to the warehouse every morning with her back straight and her eyes clear. That woman went home each night and had to measure her child's life into tiny drops, had to weigh the breath of a little boy against money that was never enough. The drawing of 3 people holding hands, the one he kept in the breast pocket of his suit, suddenly became strangely heavy, because now he understood that the house with the chimney breathing smoke in that picture was not something the boy had, but something he dreamed of, something his mother was cutting medicine into smaller portions to keep him alive long enough to dream about. He stepped back quietly, not wanting her to know he had seen, because he understood that for someone like Rose, being caught in her weakest moment would be more humiliating than hunger itself, and her pride was the last thing she still had in her hands. He had no right to take it from her. But when he turned and walked out of the warehouse, his face was no longer the face of the man who had entered a short while earlier. Something inside him had hardened, and something else had melted, both at the same time. For the past 5 years, he had built an empire on the principle of never letting emotion lead him, never allowing anyone close enough to hurt him, and yet in only a few short days, a mother measuring medicine with a spoon and a little boy drawing pictures with a dull pencil had slipped through every wall he had built. He stopped beside his car in the cold wind, took out his phone, and in the frighteningly calm voice his men had learned to both respect and fear, he gave a brief order. He wanted to know everything about Rose Marchetti, about the husband who had walked away, and about the debt hanging over her head like a blade. It took several more days, and one late afternoon, when snow began falling again outside the warehouse windows, before Tobias heard that story from Rose's own mouth, not through the cold reports his men had placed on his desk, but in her quiet voice as the two of them sat taking a break beside 2 steaming cups of black coffee. He did not press her, because he knew she was the kind of woman who would close tighter the more she was questioned. So he only sat there, silent and patient, letting the silence draw her words out on its own. "I was studying to be a nurse," she said, her eyes lowered to the coffee as though the past lay at the bottom of the cup, almost finished. "I only had the final exam and a few more months of training left before I could stand in a real hospital, wearing the white uniform, doing the work I had dreamed about since I was little." She gave a faint laugh, one without any joy in it, the kind of laugh people let out when looking back at a version of themselves that had died long ago. "Then I met Frank." That name was spoken with a weariness that had gone beyond anger. the exhaustion of someone who had blamed too many times until she no longer had the strength to blame anymore. He was charming, knew how to make people laugh, knew how to promise things that I was young enough and lonely enough to believe back then. I got pregnant with Eli, and I thought, all right, I'll put school aside for a little while, have the baby, then go back. People do that all the time. She paused, her finger turning the cup slowly. But people don't tell you how hard it is to open certain doors again once they've closed, especially when you're alone. Rose continued, piece by piece, telling him about the years that followed. About how Frank went to work at first, and then gradually only went out drinking. About promises wearing thinner and thinner like peeling paint on the walls of their rented apartment. And then came the season when the whole city of Hartwell seemed to collapse all at once. When the large textile mills along the river shut down one after another, throwing thousands of people into the streets within only a few months, and work suddenly became as scarce as water in the desert. She spoke of it in only a few sentences, without analysis, without complaining about the times, because to her it was not an economics lesson, but simply the ground giving way beneath the feet of her small family. Frank lost his job at the mill, and then he panicked, she said, her voice dropping lower. He started borrowing money, borrowing from people he should never have borrowed from, then putting it into one get-rich-quick scheme after another, and every one of them collapsed. One night I woke up and he was gone. He took the car, the little cash we had left in the house, and left me with a 2-year-old boy, a stack of debt papers I didn't even know existed, and the names of the people he had borrowed from. Tobias sat motionless and did not interrupt, though every word she said matched with chilling precision what the reports had already told him. And that very match made him even more certain that she was telling the truth, that this woman was not decorating her tragedy to buy pity. On the contrary, she told it with a restraint that made it seem as though she were ashamed of it. I'm not telling you this so you'll feel sorry for me, she said bluntly, lifting her eyes to him, and her gaze had that familiar sharpness again. I'm telling you because you hired me, and a person who hires someone else has the right to know who they're hiring. I'm not poor because I'm lazy. I work from before the sun comes up until Eli goes to sleep. I'm poor because this whole city fell apart all at once, and because I trusted the wrong person. Those are the only 2 crimes I'm guilty of. That sentence, the bare pride inside it, made Tobias look at her for a long time, because he recognized in her something he rarely encountered in the world of people, always blaming others around him, a person who had endured injustice and still refused to let that injustice turn her into a victim. He wanted to tell her that he already knew, that he knew about Frank, about the debt, about the name hanging behind all of this, but he held himself back because it was still too soon, and because that name was so heavy that he did not yet know how to set it down in front of her. The name Rose had not dared to speak. Tobias found on his own only a few days later, in the dark paneled office above another warehouse at the far end of the harbor district, where he ran his empire through brief meetings and even briefer phone calls. His most trusted subordinate, a quiet man named Bishop who had followed him from the beginning, placed a thin file on the wooden desk, and when Tobias opened it, his eyes stopped on one underlined name, and his whole face darkened like the sky before a storm. Salvatore Greco. He did not need to read every page beneath it to understand what he was facing, because in the underworld where Tobias ruled one part of the city, the Greco name was something everyone knew, but few dared touch. It's Sal Greco, Bishop said quietly, as if speaking the man's name left a bitter taste in his mouth. Her husband borrowed from one of his consumer lending companies. On paper, it's perfectly clean, licensed, contracted, signed in full. But you and I both know how Greco really makes his money. Tobias nodded slowly, his finger tapping lightly against the desktop in a steady rhythm. The rhythm those around him had learned meant anger was being held beneath a layer of ice. He knew Sal Greco, not closely, but enough to understand. Greco was the kind of predator the modern world preferred. A man who did not need street names or open threats. A man who wore tailored suits, sat in an office with glass walls overlooking the river, and stripped people bare through fine print that the law not only failed to forbid, but sometimes protected. He lent money under a legal label, then tightened the debt through stacked penalties that turned a small loan into a bottomless pit. And when the prey had nothing left to lose, he swallowed their home, their land, their future, all of it lawful, all of it supported by documents. That was exactly what made Tobias, for the first time in many years, feel as if his powerful hands had suddenly become useless. In his world, a problem like this should have had a familiar solution. A visit in the night, a message that did not need to be spoken aloud, and the debt would disappear on its own along with the man who had created it. But Sal Greco did not live in that world. He lived in the dangerous crossing place between crime and respectability, shielded not by gunmen but by things far harder to break. Judges who had received donations for their campaigns, city council members who sat beside him at charity events, local newspapers that printed photographs of him cutting ribbons at community centers he had sponsored. Greco had bought himself armor made of respectability, and touching him with force meant Tobias would drag the entire legal power machine of the city against himself, putting everything he had built in danger, and worst of all, pushing Rose and Eli into the center of a war they had no chance of surviving. "Do you want me to handle him our way?" Bishop asked, his voice low, and the question hung in the air with all its weight. Tobias stayed silent for a long time. His eyes turned toward the window where the Hartwell River moved black beneath the evening sky, and at last he shook his head. "No," he said, and even he was surprised by the certainty in his own voice. "If I handle him that way, I'll give him exactly what he needs to turn her into the widow of an investigation. He's better protected than I thought. Hitting him with a fist is walking straight into a noose." Bishop lifted an eyebrow, because in all the years he had followed Tobias, this was one of the rare times he had seen his employer refuse the road they both knew so well. "Then what?" he asked. Tobias looked down at the file again, at Greco's underlined name, then at the copied debt papers beneath it, bearing the trembling signature of a man who had run away and left the burden to a woman who had never been asked. "Then this time," he said slowly, almost to himself, "we'll have to beat him with the very thing he's hiding behind, with the law, with paper, with light, not darkness." And even as he said it, Tobias understood that he had just chosen the hardest road, the longest road, and the one most unfamiliar to the man he had become. Not far away, in a cramped little room inside the offices of the Hartwell Ledger, where towering stacks of files crowded together with cups of coffee that had gone cold long ago, another woman was also tracing the name Salvatore Greco, but from an entirely different direction, and for a reason that had sunk deep into her bones. Dana Kowalski was in her 30s, small in build, but with a persistence in her eyes people often saw in those who had decided to pursue something to the end, no matter the price. She was the daughter of a textile mill worker, and she still remembered with perfect clarity the day her father came home carrying a cardboard box filled with a few personal belongings from his locker at the mill, the face of a man who had once seemed as solid as stone, suddenly bewildered and adrift. When the factory that had fed an entire neighborhood for decades closed its doors forever. She had watched her family struggle, had seen her father borrow small sums of money and then keep sliding downward. And although her family had been lucky enough to steady itself again, she never forgot the feeling of the ground giving way beneath an honest family's feet in a single night. That memory had led her into journalism, and now, after many months of digging in silence, it was leading her straight to the polished office door of Sal Greco. On the board hanging in Dana's workroom, she had pinned dozens of slips of paper, each one connected by red thread, each slip a name, a family, a tragedy. There was a man who had once owned a small auto repair shop, passed down through 3 generations, who had borrowed from Greco to survive a slow season, and then lost both the shop and the apartment above it. There was a widow who had to carry her 2 children out of Hartwell in the night, disappearing from the city without leaving an address, fleeing penalty clauses that kept piling on top of one another like an avalanche. There were marriages broken under the weight of money, houses seized, children forced to change schools in the middle of the year, an entire map of lives crushed flat. And the one thing they all had in common, the link that connected every tragedy, led back to a single name placed at the very center of the board, circled in dark red ink: Salvatore Greco. What drove Dana mad, what kept her awake through many nights, was that everything Greco did existed in the gray area of the law, woven so carefully that each individual case looked like a lawful transaction between 2 willing parties, and only when all of them were placed side by side, only when the repeated pattern across dozens of people became visible, could one recognize that this was not bad luck, but a machine built to exploit, a systematic model. But a pattern was hard to publish if there were no real people of flesh and blood willing to speak. And that was Dana's problem, because nearly all of Greco's victims were too frightened, too ashamed, or had vanished too far away to be found again. That afternoon, while reviewing a set of loan files that an anonymous source inside City Hall had secretly passed to her, Dana's eyes stopped on a name she had never seen before: Frank Marchetti. A loan in the husband's name, But what caught her attention was a note in the margin, showing that the person currently responsible for paying the debt was not Frank, but someone named Rosalind Marchetti, his wife, a woman who had been pushed beneath the burden of a debt she had not even signed for in the beginning. Something about that detail made Dana sit up straight, because this was exactly what she had been searching for all this time. Not a victim who had fled or gone silent, but a woman still in Hartwell, still bracing herself against the weight, someone who might still have enough fire inside her to dare speak. She pulled the slip bearing Rose's name from the stack of files, pinned it to the board, and connected it to Greco's name at the center with a new red thread. Then she reached for the coat hanging behind the door, slipped her notebook into her pocket, and stepped out into the snow, without knowing that the woman she was about to seek had accidentally entered the orbit of another powerful man, and that three seemingly unrelated fates were about to collide in a way no one could have foreseen. Tobias came to Rose's apartment one evening, when the snow had stopped falling but the cold still cut against the skin, and the moment he crossed the threshold, he understood why she had been measuring medicine with a spoon. The apartment was on the 3rd floor of an old building on the north side, the hallway thick with the smell of damp and mildew, and inside it was clean to a degree that was almost painful, because that cleanliness was the desperate effort of someone trying to hold on to the last shred of dignity in circumstances that had taken nearly everything else from her. A thin blanket was folded neatly on the faded sofa. A few old toys were arranged tidily in the corner, and on the windowsill sat a small plant someone had tried to keep alive through the winter. Eli was sleeping deeply in the little room beside them, the door left slightly ajar so that a weak line of light from the night lamp slipped out, and Rose, after one brief hesitation, quietly pulled that door a little closer shut, the instinctive gesture of a mother wanting to keep her child's sleep separate from whatever was about to happen. "I'm not used to having guests," she said softly, pouring him a glass of plain water because there was nothing else in the apartment to offer, and the bare honesty of that sentence made something inside Tobias ache. He did not sit down at once, but stood there for a moment, and when he spoke, he chose to go straight to the point, because he knew that with Rose, any circling around the truth would be taken as another form of pity. "I know about the debt," he said. "I know about Greco." Rose froze in the middle of the room, the glass of water in her hand tilting slightly, and every emotion crossed her face in a flash, from shock to defense, and then to a kind of shame. She hurried to hide behind the familiar lift of her chin. "So you investigated me," she said, her voice turning cold. "All those words about hiring an honest person, about the warehouse, were just to lead to this." Tobias did not deny it. "Partly," he admitted, and that honesty itself made her pause, because she had been waiting for an excuse, not a confession. "But I didn't come here to give you money, Rose. I know you'd throw it back in my face, and honestly, if you accepted it, I'd be disappointed in you." He set the glass of water down on the table without taking a sip. "I came to offer you a real job. Not the warehouse. I'm starting a project to renovate an entire row of old buildings on the south side into affordable rental apartments. Legal, decent, with every permit in place. It's a large project, and it needs someone to manage it every day. Someone who knows how to calculate, someone who cares about people, and not only numbers, someone I can trust. I'll pay you the proper salary for that job, not 1 cent more, not because of kindness, but because you'll earn every dollar of it." Rose looked at him for a long time, and he could see her pride wrestling with something larger. "Why?" she asked. And this time the question was not sharp the way it always had been, but quiet, almost tired. "Why are you doing all this for a stranger? Don't tell me it's just business, because we both know it isn't." Tobias fell silent, and in that moment Clara's name rose in his throat, the true reason behind all of it, but he could not say it yet, not now, so he only answered, "Because I once watched someone sink and didn't reach out in time. I don't want to watch that happen again. You can consider that a selfish reason if you want, because it's more for me than it is for you." That answer, the naked truth it revealed, left Rose with nothing more to say. She turned, walked to the door of her son's room, gently pushed it open a little, and stood there looking at Eli as he slept, his small chest rising and falling evenly in the peaceful sleep that only warmth and safety could bring, the kind of sleep she had traded pieces of her pride to win for him night after night. She thought of the medicine bottle growing emptier, of the bills stacked on top of one another, of the deadline she knew Greco would never forget, and she understood that there were moments when holding on to pride meant letting her child drown along with it. When she turned back, her eyes held a new light, not surrender, but decision. "I'll take the job," she said, "but I'm taking it because I deserve it, not because I owe you. You need to understand that clearly." Salvatore Greco chose the very day the snow had melted into sticky gray mud on the streets to appear, as if he possessed an instinct for arriving precisely when people's lives looked most threadbare. His glossy black Lincoln slid up in front of the building being renovated on the south side, where Rose had been working at her new job for a little more than a week, and parked arrogantly right in the middle of the path, as though the entire street belonged to him. Eli was not there that day. The boy was at the lantern under the warm care of Marlene, who had volunteered to watch him after school, and Rose silently gave thanks for that the moment she saw the man step out of the car, because there were encounters a child should never have to witness. Sal Greco wore a flawless cream-white suit without a single wrinkle, strangely out of place amid the mud, brick, and mortar around him. His silver hair combed smoothly back, and on his face was a smile, the kind of broad, warm smile that might have made someone mistake him for a kind man if they did not look into his eyes. But his eyes were cold and flat as ice, the eyes of a man who looked at people and saw only numbers in a ledger. "Miss Marchetti," he said, his voice smooth as velvet. "How good to see you. You've been harder to find than I expected." Rose set down the set of plans in her hands, her spine going rigid, but she did not take a single step back. "I know who you are," she said, "and I know why you're here." Greco's smile spread wider, as if her resistance were a seasoning that made the meal more enjoyable. He drew a neatly folded paper from inside his coat, not handing it to her, only holding it up between two fingers like a trump card. "I'm here to remind you of a small clause that perhaps that coward husband of yours, the one who ran away, forgot to explain," he said, his voice lingering over every word with pleasure. "There's a clause regarding inability to pay. When the borrower enters a state of no longer being able to meet the payment schedule, the entire debt may be called due immediately. And you, my poor girl, are very deep in that condition." He paused, letting the next number fall like a stone. $22,000, in full, in 3 weeks, 21 days from today. Rose felt the ground seem to sway beneath her feet, but she had grown so used to that feeling that she did not let it show on her face. "That's money no honest person can earn in 3 weeks, and you know that perfectly well," she said. "That's the point, isn't it? You don't want me to pay. You want me to fail." Greco had not yet answered when another voice sounded from behind her, low and flat, and the air changed at once. "She's right, Sal." Tobias stepped out from inside the building, where he often stopped by to check the progress, and when Greco realized who was standing before him, his creamy smile froze for one instant, only one, but long enough for Rose to see that even a man like Greco had to recalculate when the name Hale entered the game. "Tobias Hale," Greco said, recovering his composure with admirable speed, his smile returning, though this time there was an added layer of caution beneath it. "I didn't know you'd taken an interest in charitable housing work. Or perhaps Miss Marchetti here means something special to you." His eyes flicked back and forth between them, calculating, measuring, and Rose could clearly see two predators assessing each other's territory. Tobias did not answer the provocation. His face remained a mask of stone. "Her debt is a mess of exploitative clauses you know very well won't hold up if examined closely," he said. "Let her go, Sal. You have this whole city to bleed. You don't need one more single mother." Greco laughed, a soft little laugh full of amusement, and slipped the paper back into his coat pocket with the unhurried motion of a man certain he held the stronger hand. "This is the interesting part, Hale," he said, each word sweet and ice-sharp. "Your influence at the harbor, the things you're used to doing in the dark, they don't mean anything here. This is a matter of books. Contracts, signatures, the law. She signed those papers, not you. And no fist of yours can erase a legal signature." He turned and walked back toward the Lincoln, then looked over his shoulder, his smile still perfectly intact. 21 days, Miss Marchetti. The clock has started running." The warning came on the third night after that encounter, at the deep, ungodly hour when the entire harbor district had sunk into sleep and snow had begun to drift lightly over the streets again. The lantern had been closed for a long time by then. Marlene had gone home. Rose and Eli were sleeping quietly in their apartment a few streets away, and that very emptiness was the only thing that kept the matter from becoming worse. No one saw exactly what happened. Only the traces left behind the next morning told the story. The large front window of the diner, the one still bearing the words "The Lantern" in gold paint faded by the years, had shattered into a giant spiderweb, before collapsing onto the sidewalk in countless glittering pieces beneath the streetlight, laying a sheet of false ice over the real snow. A brick lay crooked in the middle of the diner floor, and wrapped around it with a rubber band was a scrap of paper, with a few words scrawled in black ink, an unsigned message that did not need a signature for everyone to understand where it had come from, saying, in essence, that anyone who sheltered and helped debtors should ask themselves how safe their own property really was. That was Greco's way, or more precisely the way of the men he hired, never leaving a trail that could lead back to him, never doing anything serious enough to force the police to truly act, only just enough to sow fear, just enough to remind people that his respectable armor did not mean he lacked dirty hands to command in the dark. Marlene was the first to see it when she arrived to open the diner early in the morning, and she stood silently for a long while among the broken glass, not because she was afraid, but because a quiet anger was rising in the chest of a woman who had lived long enough to recognize a cowardly threat when she saw one. She did not call Rose right away, because she knew that woman would blame herself, would think this trouble had come because of her, and Marlene did not want to place one more weight on shoulders already bent too far. Instead, she called Tobias, and when he arrived, he stood in the diner looking at the shattered window with a stillness more frightening than any rage, his jaw clenched tight, and Marlene, who had known him for many years, understood that beneath that calm surface something was boiling to its limit. For one moment, the old instinct rose in him, the instinct long accustomed to settling matters in the way his world always had, and he almost reached for his phone to call Bishop, to answer this message with a message far heavier. But then he stopped, because he knew that was exactly what Greco wanted. The man wanted to drag him back into the mud where he could turn him into a criminal, where every advantage belonged to the one protected by the law. Just then, an unfamiliar woman appeared at the threshold, holding a small camera and a notebook, and that was the first time Tobias saw Dana Kowalski. She had heard about the vandalism through a contact in the local police, and professional instinct had drawn her here. But when she stepped inside and saw the lantern sign, along with the broken glass, something larger than a news item made her stop. She introduced herself as a reporter for the Hartwell Ledger, and when Greco's name was mentioned, she saw Marlene and the man in the dark suit both change expression, and she understood that she had just accidentally stepped into an important link in the chain. She asked permission to photograph the shattered window, the note, the brick, recorded every detail carefully, and explained that she had been tracking Greco for many months, that this was not the first time someone who dared stand against him had met with strange misfortunes like this. Tobias looked at that small but steadfast woman, and for the first time since he had decided to choose the road of light instead of darkness, he felt that road was not quite so lonely anymore, because every shard of broken glass, every cowardly threat like this, under Dana's pen and camera lens, was no longer only a wound, but had begun to turn into something else, into evidence. That night, after Dana had left, and Marlene had been persuaded to go home and rest, Tobias drove Rose back to her apartment, and after she stopped by the diner to pick up Eli and laid the sleeping boy in bed, she came back out and found him still standing by the window, looking down at the street covered with snow, with a distant expression she had never seen before on this man, who always controlled everything. She poured him a cup of coffee, and instead of letting him leave as she always had before, she spoke in a quiet voice. "You've helped me more than anyone ever has, and I still don't understand why. Today at the apartment, you said you once watched someone sink and didn't reach out in time. I think I deserve to know who that person was." Tobias stayed silent for a very long time, so long that Rose thought he would never answer, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low and small, carrying the exhaustion of a burden he had worn for too many years. "Her name was Clara," he said. "My sister, 6 years younger than me." He paused, his fingers tightening around the coffee cup as if searching for something to hold on to. "Back then I was young, and I was obsessed with climbing in the world I thought mattered more than anything else. I wanted money, power, to never have to be afraid or go without again, and I let that hunger swallow me whole. Clara was different. She was gentle, always worrying about other people, the kind of person who gave more than she ever received." Rose sat down across from him and said nothing, only listened, because she understood that some stories needed to be told at their own pace. "She got sick," Tobias continued, his eyes fixed on some invisible point in the past. "At first, it was small things, the sort everyone thought would pass. But it didn't pass. It kept getting worse, and she needed treatment. Good doctors, the kind of care money has to buy. But she didn't call me. She knew I was busy, knew I was building my empire, and she didn't want to bother me, didn't want to become a burden. She tried to manage on her own, tried to hold on, knocked on door after door and was turned away again and again. Because poor people are always told to wait, to fill out this form, to come back later, while their bodies don't know how to wait. His voice grew rough, and Rose saw his hand tremble slightly. By the time I found out, it was too late. I had an entire fortune in my hands. Enough money to buy her a whole hospital if I had needed to. And still, I wasn't there at the moment when one phone call, one hand reaching out at the right time, could have changed everything. I was too busy to save the only person in the world who still truly loved me. He lifted his eyes to Rose, and in those eyes that were usually cold as ice, there was now a pain so bare that she had to hold herself still, not to look away. For 5 years, I told myself I had packed enough ice around my heart that I'd never have to feel that again. I stayed away from people, stayed away from every attachment, because attachment means there can be loss, and I didn't think I could survive losing anyone else. He shook his head faintly. Then you walked into that diner, soaked through, proud and desperate, leading a little boy with a dry cough, and that boy drew me a picture exactly like the one Clara once drew for me when she was small. You can't know, Rose, what it feels like when an entire past you buried suddenly stands up and looks you straight in the face. Rose sat in silence, tears rolling down her cheeks without her bothering to wipe them away, not because she pitied him, but because she recognized 2 wounded people sitting across from each other in that small room, each carrying a wound the other had unknowingly touched and eased. "You aren't to blame for your sister's death," she said softly, addressing him in a more intimate way for the first time. "The system turned its back on her, not you." Tobias looked at her, and in his eyes something seemed to break and mend at the same time. "Maybe," he replied, "but I was late once, Rose. I swore to myself that I'd never be late again. And I won't let Greco do to you and Eli what this whole world did to Clara. I promise you that." The promise Tobias gave Rose that night was not something he could keep in full if he remained the man the entire Hartwell Harbor district treated with caution. Because to defeat Greco with light, he would have to step out of the darkness that had sheltered him for so many years, and that step carried a price he understood better than anyone. The next morning, he called Bishop to the office above the warehouse, and when the quiet man who had followed him from the earliest days walked in, Tobias spoke plainly about the decision he had made during a long, sleepless night. He would withdraw, not in one night, not through some declaration, but one step at a time. He would transfer operations, cut off the business ties that existed in the gray areas of the law, hand over control of the parts he could hand over, and close the parts he could not. Bishop listened, his face revealing nothing, but his eyes said everything about the worry a loyal man carries for the one he follows. "You understand what this means, don't you?" Bishop said quietly, not as a question, but as a reminder. "The moment people smell that you're withdrawing, that you're loosening your grip, they won't see a man finding his way back. They'll see an empty space. And in our world, empty spaces never last long. Someone will want to fill it. The reputation you spent years building so no one would dare touch you, it'll start to crack the moment you loosen your hand." Tobias stood by the window, looking down at the gray river, and he did not deny a single word, because everything Bishop said was true. He knew very well the men who were waiting, the rivals who had feared the Hale name for years and would see his retreat as a crack they could slip through, knew that some of the relationships that had once protected him would turn away when he was no longer a man worth fearing, knew that in the nights to come he would have to sleep with a vigilance he had not needed for many years. He was voluntarily removing his own armor, and he was doing it with his eyes wide open, fully aware of every risk. "I know," he said at last, his voice low and steady. "I know what I'm trading away. All my life, I accumulated power because I believed it was the only thing that could keep me safe, keep me from ever being helpless again the way I was the day I lost Clara. But I've just realized something, Bishop. All that power never saved anyone. It only made people afraid of me. And a man feared by an entire city can still stand there watching his sister fade away and be unable to do anything, because it was the wrong kind of power." Bishop stayed silent for a long while, and in that silence, there was both understanding and the regret of a man about to watch the world he knew begin to change. "And what about me?" he asked. And the question carried its own weight, because Bishop's whole life had been tied to Tobias's. Tobias turned back to look at his longtime companion, and for the first time in this story, something close to gentleness passed across his severe face. "You're free, Bishop," he said. "You've followed me long enough. I'll make sure you're taken care of, and you can choose your own road. But if you want to stay, then stay to help me build something that this time we don't have to hide beneath the streetlights. That housing project is real. It can become something real, not a front." Bishop looked at him for a long time, then gave a faint nod, a nod that said more than 1,000 vows, and in that moment, the two men who had once walked through darkness together understood that they had just crossed a line from which there was no turning back. After Bishop had gone, Tobias remained alone in the room that had once been the center of an entire empire, looking around at the walls that had witnessed so many decisions made in the dark, and he felt a very real fear, the fear of a man taking apart with his own hands the only thing he had ever known how to build. But beneath that fear, for the first time in 5 years, there was something else, light and unfamiliar, almost like the feeling of a man setting down a burden he had carried so long that he had forgotten how heavy it was. He took the drawing of 3 people holding hands from his breast pocket, looked at it once more in the daylight, then carefully put it back, right above his heart, where it had rested through the past days like a reminder of why he had chosen this difficult road. In the days that followed, the small meeting room inside the building under renovation became a strange kind of headquarters, a place where 3 people from 3 different worlds worked together to weave a net meant to trap a predator, and for the first time in a very long while, Rose felt she was no longer standing alone against the whole world. The first line of attack came from a woman attorney Tobias had brought in, someone who did not belong to his underworld, but was a sharp civil lawyer specializing in consumer rights. The moment she placed Frank's loan contracts on the table, she immediately recognized the very thing Greco had always counted on his desperate debtors never knowing. The actual interest rate in this contract, once all the hidden fees, penalty fees, and extension fees they buried in the fine print are added together, goes far beyond the limit allowed by state law, she said, tapping one clause with her finger. They disguised it cleverly, splitting it into dozens of separate items, so that no single item looks illegal on its own. But when I combine them all and calculate the real number, this contract isn't only exploitative, it's illegal. And a loan contract with an interest rate above the legal ceiling can be declared invalid in part or in full. Greco does not have the right to demand that money from you in the way he's demanding it. Rose listened with her heart pounding, because for all those months she had believed that debt was a sentence with no appeal, and yet now someone was telling her that the very paper she had thought was binding her was the noose wrapped around the neck of the man who had said it. The second line of attack lay in Dana Kowalski's hands, and it was the thing Greco feared more than any legal clause, because the law was something he could delay, something he could hire skilled lawyers to argue against, but public opinion was not. For months, Dana had patiently knocked on the doors of one victim after another. And now, strengthened by the fact that they no longer had to stand alone, many of them were beginning to agree to speak. An auto repair shop owner agreed to tell his story under his real name. A mother who had once been forced to leave the city was now willing to testify by phone. And most important of all, the vandalism at the lantern, with the brick, the threatening note, and the photographs Dana had taken, had become the concrete link, joining vague threats to real action. "This is what makes it impossible for him to silence us," Dana explained, her eyes bright with the fire of someone finally nearing the thing she had chased for years. "He can crush one victim, buy them off or scare them, but a whole series of articles with dozens of witnesses all pointing to the same pattern, published in an independent newspaper he doesn't own and doesn't control, that's something he can't stop. The Ledger doesn't take his money, doesn't owe him favors, and once this story reaches page 1, every judge and councilman who ever smiled beside him in a photograph will rush to stand far away from him." And the third line of attack, the quietest one but the one with the deepest meaning, was for Rose herself. Tobias had looked into her past and discovered that she was only missing the final exam and a short period of training to complete the nursing degree she had once been forced to abandon, and he had quietly connected her with a program that would allow her to finish what remained, not so she could repay the debt in 3 weeks, which was impossible and everyone understood that, but for an entirely different reason. "Defeating Greco is a matter for the law and the press," he told her, "but taking back your life can't wait until he falls. You begin again now, not because of him, but because of you and Eli." A community hospital had agreed to take her on with a conditional offer, pending the completion of her certificate, and for the first time since the night Frank disappeared, Rose saw something ahead of her that was not a wall, but a door. She sat among those 3 people, the lawyer, the reporter, and the man the whole city had once feared who was now risking his position for her. And she understood that this fight was no longer hers alone. It had become the fight of all the people Greco had once believed were too small, too alone, too afraid to ever dare stand against him. On the 19th day, 2 days before the deadline Greco was certain would crush her, Rose walked into his office, not with a check and trembling hands as he had expected, but with 2 companions at her sides and a thick pair of files in her hands. Greco's office was exactly as Tobias had imagined it, spacious and polished, with a glass wall looking out over the river, and certificates of merit and photographs of him shaking hands with powerful figures hung neatly like a suit of armor made from respectability. He looked up from the large wooden desk, and for one brief moment his familiar cream-smooth smile appeared. But when he saw the serious woman attorney in a suit and the woman holding a camera beside Rose, that smile stalled at the corners of his mouth. "Miss Marchetti," he said, his voice still trying to keep its silk-like smoothness, "I don't recall making an appointment to receive an entire delegation." Rose did not sit in the chair. He did not bother to offer. She placed the first file on the glossy surface of his desk and pushed it forward. "I'm here to answer your 3-week deadline," she said, her voice so calm it surprised even her, because that calm had come from a place fear could no longer reach. The attorney spoke next, each sentence clear and cold as a surgeon's cut, laying out the actual interest rate that exceeded the legal ceiling, the possibility that the contract could be declared invalid, the fact that instead of Rose owing him, he might very well be the one required to return the sums he had collected beyond the lawful limit, and a complaint already prepared to be filed with the State Consumer Protection Agency. Greco listened, his face gradually hardening, but he was an old fox and did not collapse easily. He let out a soft laugh and waved his hand as if brushing away a speck of dust. "Every lawyer knows how to exaggerate things," he said. "My contracts have passed through the hands of the best people. Go ahead and sue. I have an entire team waiting, and I have time, money, 1,000 times more than she does. You'll wear yourselves out before you ever reach a courtroom." That was when Dana stepped forward and placed the second file beside the first, and when she opened it, the last trace of the smile finally vanished from Greco's face. Inside was the draft of a series of investigative articles, along with a list of witnesses willing to use their real names. Photographs of the shattered window and the threatening note at the lantern, an entire map of the lives his machine had crushed, all arranged into one clear and undeniable story. "This isn't a single lawsuit you can drag out until the other side is exhausted," Dana said, her voice firm as steel. "This is a series of articles that will run on the front page of the Hartwell Ledger, a newspaper you don't own and can't buy. And once it's published, all your clever little clauses will no longer be merely a civil matter. They'll become the question of why a supposedly respectable man allowed his debtors to be threatened and their property vandalized. That's when prosecutors start paying attention, and that's when every judge and councilman hanging on that wall," she tipped her head toward the framed photographs, "will pretend they never knew who you were." Silence covered the room, a silence entirely different from the frightened silence Greco was used to creating in others, and this time it was tightening around him. He sat down slowly, his eyes sweeping over the 2 files, and Rose could see the cold, calculating machine in his head running at full force, weighing the cost of pursuing this debt against the cost of having the entire respectable empire he had worked so hard to build exposed in the light. Greco was not a man who knew remorse. He did not release Rose because his conscience troubled him. He released her because he was a businessman, and a good businessman knew when to cut his losses. $22,000, he finally said, his voice stripped of all sweetness, leaving only cold bitterness. "Isn't worth trading all of that for." He pulled the original debt papers from a drawer, and with a motion of controlled fury, tore them in half and threw them onto the desk. "The debt is cancelled. Leave, Miss Marchetti, and don't ever let me hear your name again." Rose looked at the torn scraps of the thing that had haunted her sleep for so many months lying ragged across the desk. And she did not feel triumphant, did not feel satisfied by his defeat. She only felt an immense relief rising like water breaking through a dam, and beneath it was a new pride, not the hard pride she had used to defend herself, but the pride of a person who had stood straight against injustice and won without having to trade away her dignity. The relief after the 19th day did not last long before Hartwell's winter delivered its final test, and it came on a night at the end of the month, when the season's largest snowstorm swept through the city, covering every street in white, and turning the world beyond the windows into a swirling blank curtain. Rose had put Eli to bed early, but sometime past midnight she jolted awake because her son's breathing had become harder than usual, and when she switched on the light and ran into his room, her heart clenched at the sight of his small chest struggling to rise and fall, his little shoulders tightening with every breath. Eli's asthma attack had worsened, perhaps because of the brutal cold, perhaps because the medicine bottle she had been forced to stretch for so long was now almost empty, and Rose's hand trembled when she reached for it, shook it gently, and realized what remained was not enough to carry her through a night like this with any peace. She tried to stay calm, holding her son against her, whispering gentle words to soothe both him and herself, but she knew the boy needed to be taken to the hospital, and she knew that in the middle of this storm, no taxi would come, and her own legs could never carry him for miles through snow-buried streets. In that panic, she did the thing that only a few weeks earlier she could not have imagined doing. She called Tobias. He answered after just one ring, as though he had never truly slept deeply since the day he stepped into the lives of mother and son, and when he heard her voice, he did not ask many questions, only said 3 words, "I'm coming now," then ended the call. 15 minutes later, in the middle of a storm that every sensible person had chosen to stay inside to avoid, Tobias's headlights cut through the curtain of snow in front of her building, and he ran up 3 flights of stairs in one stretch without stopping. He lifted Eli in steady arms, wrapped the boy in his own heavy coat, held him against his chest to give him warmth, and when he spoke to Rose, his voice was urgent and reassuring at once. "We'll get him there in time. You sit in the back and hold him. I'll handle the road." The drive through that snowstorm was one of the hardest things Tobias had ever done. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as the car slid over the icy road, his field of vision reduced to only a few yards ahead of the hood. But he drove with absolute focus, slow and steady, speaking evenly to Eli through the rearview mirror to keep the boy awake and calm, telling him about a street where maple trees grew thick and green in the summer, about a backyard where they could put a swing, weaving warm images out of words to pull the child's mind away from the pain inside his chest. Rose sat in the back holding her son, and through the blur of tears she looked at the back of the man driving her whole world through the storm, and she understood that he was no longer only a benefactor, no longer only an employer, but something far greater than either. When they reached the hospital, the doctors and nurses took Eli at once and brought him inside, and after a while of receiving proper care and the medicine Rose had been unable to afford for so long, the boy's breathing gradually steadied. His small chest no longer fought so hard, and he slipped into the kind of peaceful sleep he had not known in a very long time. Rose and Tobias sat beside each other on the hard chairs in the hallway, both of them wet and cold and exhausted, and when the doctor came out to tell them the boy was stable, that there was nothing more to worry about, Rose dropped her head onto Tobias's shoulder and burst into tears, not crying from fear anymore, but crying because everything she had carried alone for so long no longer had to be carried alone. Tobias wrapped his arms around her, and in that quiet moment in the nearly empty hospital corridor, he realized something that warmed the heart he had once frozen shut, that the fear of arriving too late, the fear that had haunted him for 5 years, had been defeated tonight for the first time. He had made it in time. When he stepped softly into the room and looked at Eli sleeping, the boy opened his eyes a little, recognized him, and through lips, still tired, gave him a small smile, before whispering the words Tobias would carry with him for the rest of his life. "I knew you'd come." Eli stayed in the hospital for 2 more days, so the doctors could make sure his small chest had fully stabilized. And during those 2 days, the hospital room that had first felt cold and unfamiliar slowly became strangely warm, because it was rarely ever empty. Rose hardly left her son's side, while Tobias came by every day, sometimes bringing a brand new box of colored pencils, sometimes a picture book, and Marlene came too with a tin of cookies she had baked herself, filling the room with the scent of butter and sugar, until it no longer felt like a hospital at all, but like a home. On the second morning, when color had returned to Eli's cheeks and the energy of a 6-year-old child had come back with it, the boy asked for paper and colored pencils, and with the familiar seriousness of an artist at work, he bent over the page all morning, the tip of his tongue sticking slightly from the corner of his mouth, just as it had that first time at the lantern. When he finished, he did not give the picture to his mother, and he did not keep it for himself. Instead, he waited until Tobias stepped into the room, then held it out with both hands and a radiant smile. Tobias took the sheet of paper, and when he looked down at it, he went still just as he had the first time. But this time, what rose in his chest was not pain, but something so sweet it almost stole his breath. It was still the same 3 figures. One tall, one with long hair, one tiny figure standing in the middle, still holding hands through clumsy connecting lines, still with the house and its chimney releasing smoke, and the sun shining from the upper corner. But this time something was different. This time the house had been carefully colored in, with warm yellow windows, with a little swing in the backyard exactly like the story Tobias had told during the snowstorm. And beneath the 3 figures, written in the crooked letters of a child just learning to write, were 3 words: my home. The first picture Eli had drawn was a dream of something he did not yet have, while this picture was a declaration of something he believed he was about to have, and the difference between the 2 drawings was the entire road these 3 people had traveled together. Tobias lifted his eyes to Rose, and she was looking at him too. And in that exchanged gaze, there were many things that did not need to be spoken aloud. They had never hurried. Through all the past weeks, between danger and calculation, not once had the boundary between them been crossed in haste, because both of them were people life had wounded deeply enough to understand that the things most worth having needed to be built slowly and carefully. What had grown between them had not come from sudden passion, but from a far stronger foundation, from respect, from the way Tobias always treated Rose as an equal and not as someone he had saved, from the way Rose saw through the ice around his heart and reached the wounded man beneath, from hundreds of small moments when 2 lonely people realized that beside each other, they were a little less alone. When Rose spoke, her voice was soft and a little hesitant, a kind of hesitation that proud woman rarely allowed anyone to see. "You know," she said, "it's been a very long time since I dared let myself hope for anything. Hope is a luxury for people like me, because every time you hope, you have something to lose." But seeing him draw that swing, I realized maybe I'd forgotten that hope can also be something to hold on to, not only something to lose. Tobias stepped closer, and he did not take her hand, did not do anything that might break the fragile tenderness of the moment. He only stood there beside her, both of them looking down at the child sitting in the middle of the hospital bed, coloring in the last rays of sunlight. "Then we'll hold on to it," he said quietly. "No need to rush, one day at a time. I spent my whole life building things that collapsed because I built them on fear. This time, I want to build something on a different foundation." And Rose, the woman who had once walked into the lantern through the snow with her chin raised high to hide her despair, now smiled, a real smile, without defense, without hardness, simply warm, and she nodded. Because for the first time in many years, the future was no longer something she had to fear, but something she could wait for. 5 years passed quickly, the way winter gives way to spring, and if someone walked into Hartwell's South Side neighborhood today, they would find it hard to believe this place had once been a row of crumbling buildings waiting to be torn down. Now it was a real community, clean and decent affordable rental apartments, where families once left behind by the whole city had found a roof over their heads without fearing it would be taken from them, and at the head of the company that made it happen was a man people had once dared mention only in whispers, now spoken of with true respect. Tobias Hale had done what no one in his old world believed possible. He had stepped out of the darkness and never turned back, trading the authority built on fear for another kind of power, the power that comes from building instead of destroying. And though that road had held difficult early nights just as Bishop had warned, he had not regretted it once. Rose was now the head nurse at a community clinic, the very kind of place where Tobias's sister had once knocked on the door and been turned away. And every day she stood there in the white uniform she had once thought she had lost forever, reaching out her hand to the most desperate people, because she understood better than anyone what it felt like to have nowhere left to hold on. She had completed the degree she had once abandoned, not in some miraculous 3 weeks, but through months of studying after work, one step at a time, exactly the way all lasting things are built. Dana Kowalski, with her investigative series on the predatory lending network, had won a prestigious journalism award, and more important than the award itself, those articles had sparked an official investigation, and Salvatore Greco, the man who had once believed his armor of respectability was untouchable, was finally forced to answer before the law for what he had done. The judges and councilmen who had once smiled beside him were now the first to turn their backs, and he walked into prison, leaving behind all the numbers in the ledgers that had once been his entire world. As for Eli, the little boy who had once coughed dryly in his mother's arms in the snow, he was now a healthy, tall boy, his chest no longer forced to struggle, and he still drew, his pictures much more skillful now, yet always carrying the same familiar theme. A house, a home, 3 people standing beside one another. On the wall of Tobias's office, framed carefully in glass between certificates and permits, was that first drawing. 3 stick figures holding hands in front of a house with a chimney, the crumpled napkin from the lantern that he had kept all these years, as if he were keeping hold of his own heart. People still sometimes asked him why he had spoken up that night, why a man like him had noticed a penniless single mother at all, and his answer was always simple. He said he had grown too tired of looking away, that all his life he had believed power was the thing that kept him safe, until a soaked woman and a child with a drawing showed him that the only thing that had ever truly saved a person was not power, but compassion brave enough to act at the right moment. "She didn't save an empire for me," he would often say softly. "She gave me the road home." And perhaps that is what this story wants to leave inside each of us, that a person's dignity is not measured by the money in their pocket, but by the way they lift their head in hardship, that sometimes saving another person is the way we save ourselves, and that a hand offered at the right time, a kind word given at the right moment, can change an entire fate. Kindness is never too late, and no one, no matter how wounded, is beyond finding the way home. If the story of Rose, Tobias, and little Eli has touched something in your heart, please subscribe to our channel, hit the like button, and share this video so we can share more meaningful and heartwarming stories together every day. We would love to know how you feel about today's story and what moved you the most. So please leave a few lines in the comments to let us hear the sincere feelings from deep within your heart. Thank you for staying with us until the very last lines. I wish you and your loved ones abundant health, a peaceful life, and joy in every passing day. Goodbye, and I'll see you again in the next videos.